So I don't have a lot of slides for you guys today because I'm going to be mostly just focusing on configuration topics. So really, this is going to be deep into some cool things about ClearPass as far as configuration and showing you guys how to do some of the really neat stuff. So this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover some TACAC stuff, external database connection, and then I'm going to show you how to configure the air group LDAP lookup. To explain, I'll give you a little explanation around these. So advanced TACACs basically means if you're setting up ClearPass to be your TACACs server, and I've actually got some radius in there as well, but really to control access to your network switches. And the reason why I say the power of XML, I'm actually going to show you guys how to take XML via an export of ClearPass from ClearPass services, roles, things like that, configure it to match what you want to do, and then import it back in. And it may not seem like something that you would really need to do, but when you start talking about bringing in, say, 3,000 devices, no one's going to want to sit there and type in 3,000 devices, right? They want to be able to import it from, bring it in from like a CSV or something and bring it in that way. Well, I'm going to show you the XML and show you guys how you can import that, how you can modify the XML and add more device entries. And I'm also going to cover the user roles and device groups. And like I said, I just did an install, I believe it was a couple weeks ago, where I got on site and the majority of the time spent doing the install was waiting for them to upgrade to 6.1. And then the actual install literally was import these XML files, and then that took about, I think, 5 to 10 minutes, and then we were testing. And that was it. So I'm going to show you guys how I did that, how I built those XML files, and just to give you an idea of the power of ClearPass with XML in it. External database connection. I'm going to show you guys how to configure an external database connection. Now for this demonstration, I'm going to use the internal Insight database, but you'll understand that it's identical if it's an external database versus an internal database. It's just a different IP address, different username, different password, that's all. So it's going to be the same concept, and I'm going to be looking at MAC addresses and getting some authorization information. So I'll show you guys how to do that. And then the air group LDAP lookup is a new feature that we've got in 6.1 where you can have the field for username, so shared with user, can automatically pull that name from LDAP. So that way, if the user doesn't know, the exact spelling of a person's name, they can just start typing in a couple letters, and it will automatically fill that in. Okay, so I'm going to start with talking about XML and showing you guys what you can get from information that will help you build services and just make things a little bit more streamlined. So if I grab, let's see if I go in here. What I usually do is I usually start by saying, okay, what do I want to import? What do I want to build? So I'm going to add a role, and I'm just going to call it user1 role. And I'm going to give it a description and say, this is user1. Save that. Now, I'm going to select that user1 role, and I'm going to export it. I don't need a password protection on it. Okay, so now it's exported. So now let's take a look at that. So here's the XML for that role. So if I needed to have, like say, 50 roles, I don't want to have to go into the GUI and click for every single role and type it in. It'd be much easier if I just copied this and pasted it. And then just change this to what I wanted it to be. So I'll say use role 2. and so on and so forth. And that sort of gives you the idea of how to start with looking at this XML by doing that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually, let's see, show you guys one that I created. Okay, so for this customer, you can see they had a lot of different roles that they wanted to signify who could access what. So again, just by exporting one fake role, I was able to figure out the format of the XML and then go in and create all these different roles. Now, likewise, we can do role mappings. And again, this looks complicated first, but as soon as you start, seeing the fields, you'll understand like where these are coming from. So matches any. This is again a role mapping. So if I jump back over and go to a role mapping here, and if I were to add a new role mapping, you can see my options here are first match, select all matches. So here we go, first applicable, right? So that's how we've got the combining algorithm. And then if I add a role, you can see matches any or all. And that's where we get this matches any, operators or. And then you can see, I've got the Active Directory authorization in there. And that's how I got the role mappings. So I'm going to move along, and what I tend to do is I tend to break everything out just so I can edit it, and if I have a problem, I know where to fix that. But I'll go ahead and I'm going to actually start importing these things and show you guys. Cancel those. Show you how easy it is once you have that XML built. So for starters, let's go ahead and import our roles. Okay, so now we've got our roles in here. Now it's important when you're doing this import process to think of things from the ground up. So they're all building blocks, right? You couldn't really import role mappings unless you had the roles to begin with, right? So it's not gonna work unless that exists already. And one example, let's see, this is probably going to fail because I've got their Active Directory source in the XML file, but let's give it a try. So if I go to my role mappings, and you see that. Role mapping policy, authorization source is not present. So what I'd have to do is I have to go back, check my authorization sources. I've got one called ClearPass AD. So I go over to this, go find and replace. Save it. Now I can go to my role mappings. And voila, I have my role mappings. And in here you can see all the role mappings that I've created in the XML. So those are the roles, and now I'm going to go ahead and look at some endpoints. So I've got my TACAX endpoints right here. And you can see thousands and thousands and thousands of endpoints. Again, this is huge because you guys don't want to have to enter these one at a time. And you can just grab them from a CSV export. Maybe your source is, maybe you're moving off of Cisco ISE, hopefully. And onto ClearPass, you can get an export and bring these in here. And so then it just makes it so much easier that you can go to your endpoints, import endpoints. Oops, that was radius. Got the tag axe. Oops, that's not endpoints. Sorry, network devices. Excuse me. Didn't like one of the fields. Well, anyhow, you guys get the gist of it. It's really nice, and it's really gives you that functionality by just, again, you just take one thing you've created, export it, and then just take a look at the XML, and you'll see how the format is supposed to be. And there you are. Here's one of the devices that I created. And again, you're just going to copy this NAD client and duplicate it multiple times, and then put the information in the right format. Now, usually the way that I did it is I would take a CSV, an Excel file, and I would actually add in all these fields as necessary, and then convert it to text, do some fun with text edit to get it into the right format for the file. But again, I think that's a really versatile way of looking at building these configurations rather than trying to sit through and enter one at a time. So let me actually see if I can fix that. Just one second here. I think I know my issue. Do that. Okay, replace. All right, let's try this again. Import devices. And there we go. So now we see all of our devices are in here, all the devices that we want. So that's sort of the idea behind doing this. And like I said, guys, it just makes things so much easier to be able to do the configuration using XML data rather than manual entry. We do have some scripts that will take dumps from Cisco. So like I said, if you are upgrading or migrating from Cisco to ClearPass, we actually have scripts that'll take that data and port it into the right XML format. If you need those, please talk to your SE, and we can get that information to you and help you guys convert those files. So, all right, I'm going to jump into the SQL database configuration because this one's a bit more involved, and this is going to take a little while. So, configuring a SQL external source, before I actually go into this, does everybody understand what I'm talking about when I say having an external authorization source that's a SQL query? Does anybody not understand what that is? Okay, so I see one hand. Anybody else? Couple? Okay, so it wouldn't even have to be a device tracking database. It could be anything that you want to get authorization from. And what that means is authorization is like information about somebody connecting and to be able to do something different based on that information. It's not authentication. We're not saying whether or not they successfully authenticated. We're saying we're getting some more attributes about them and context information. So one example would be if you had a device tracking database with all of your corporate-owned devices. You've got that in a SQL database. You've got your list of 10,000 MAC addresses. And you want those devices to not have to do captive portal. Or yeah, you want to have those devices do Mac auth and get on, but not have to do captive portal, but somebody else, you might want to do something different. But we can take it even beyond that. So let's say you wanted to go to the extreme other side. You had a dense classroom environment, and there were students that would be connecting with laptops to take a test. And you knew the exact time and the exact room and the exact access points in those rooms, and you knew the student names that were in that class. Now, most of this information is all available in student tracking databases, because they track the classroom number, and they track who the students are that are supposed to be in that class, and what time and what days that class is. So you could actually define authorization rules to say, you know what, if this student is in this room at this given time, give them a higher connection speed, give them better QoS. So that way they can take their test and not be interrupted. And you know what, you could even take it a step further and say, you know what, if it's not one of those students, I don't even want them connecting to any of these access points in this room. So if they try to connect, I see that, disconnect them. Don't let them be connected. And that information is all from authorization sources, all from a SQL database. Does that make sense? All right. So to start with, to test this out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Insight database, which is inside of ClearPass. So the first thing you guys have to do is you have to change the app external password. Now what the app external password is, the app external is an account that can be used for exactly this functionality, to connect into the SQL database inside of ClearPass. Now you don't have access to everything, so all the security-focused people out there, you start thinking, whoa, SQL database is open, people can connect to it. You can't see passwords, so it's just, we're talking about contextual information. And could you use other sources to pull this SQL data? Yes. But could the schema change? Yes. The schema could change based on an update, so it's not something I'd recommend, but you can try and pull data out for other purposes, for like reporting. But so the first thing we do is we go into cluster-wide parameters, and we change this app external password. And now that I've done that, now I can actually connect into the SQL database. Now, my tool of choice is pgadmin 3. This is a great application. This application is free. It's available for Windows and for Mac, and there might be a Linux version as well. And what I have here is I've done the connection, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to blow this out so you guys can see from the ground up what you do. So here we'll just give it a name, CP61, my host. And here's the username, which is that app external, which is the one we changed in ClearPass, and the password. And then it gives you a message saying, hey, you shouldn't store passwords, security things, yada, yada. So now if we go into here, and we go into databases, we can see that we have several different options. Now for our test purposes today, I'm just going to use the Insight database. If you decide to start creating these custom SQL queries, I highly recommend you stick to the Insight database. The reason being is that it's indexed, and so the responses are quicker, and it doesn't create any excess load on the server by using the Insight database. So I drill down under Insight database, drill down under schemas, public, tables, and for my example today, I'm going to look at the auth table. Now the other nice thing that's really cool about pgadmin 3 is it helps you build SQL queries to get the data that you're looking for. So if I right-click on auth, I can say scripts, select script. And see, this pre-populated all the fields, select all the fields from that table from auth. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to build a SQL query that looks to see if the user successfully logged in more than 8 hours ago, but less than 24 days ago. So think about in a situation where you'd want to have a welcome back idea. You know, they've logged in, but they haven't logged in 8 hours, but they logged in once between that time frame of 8 hours and, actually I think it's 8 hours or 7 days is what I'm going to do. So if I hit the run button right here, which is this green arrow, you can see there's a lot of information in here. You can see all these fields. You can see the username. I've got the authentication status, so whether it's user, MAB. MAB is basically Mac auth, and then failed. If I scroll over, we get some more information. Now the key ones that we're going to focus in on are the timestamp. That's one of the major ones because we want to know when they logged in. We're also going to focus on the MAC address, so it's just MAC. And also we'll grab auth status. Because what we want to know is that they logged in, and successful login user is the successful login. So I'm going to trim this down and just grab, let's see, I'm going to grab auth status. I'm going to grab MAC. And then I'm going to grab timestamp. And now I'm going to run that. OK. So now you can see I've got the data that I'm interested in. Now, when we go to work with this back in ClearPass, all we really care about is the MAC address. But for purposes of actually building the SQL query, it's good to see the data that you're trying to work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some information to this. So I'm going to say, all right, I only want to see auth status of user. So let's add. OK. So now I've just got my auth status of user. But then the timestamp one is going to be a little bit more complicated, because when it comes to time and talking about time in a SQL query, we have to talk about it in epoch time. Now, epoch time is, I think, seconds counted from some point in 1972 when the first Unix server was booted up. But by talking about it in epoch time, we can actually get physical numbers that we can say greater than or less than of. So I'll show you, I've built this query already. I'm going to just copy it over, and then I'm going to explain to you guys what I'm doing here. So, OK, so here's what I'm doing. I'm saying select auth status MAC timestamp from auth where extract epoch from timestamp. So that basically takes that timestamp that we're looking at. In this case, it's May 27th, 2013, and there's some time. And it's going to convert it to epoch time. And I'm going to say where that epoch time is less than extract epoch from now minus 28,800 seconds. And that 28,800 seconds is 8 hours. Then I'm going to add some more contextual information and say, and extract from timestamp, again, converting it to epoch, is greater than now minus 1 week. And I'm keeping my one for the auth status equals user. So if I go ahead and play that, oops, what did I miss? There we go. Let me just clean this up so you guys can see it a little bit better. Okay. So I cleaned up, I removed the other ones. So I'm just looking at the MAC address now. So if we wanted to see the other ones, we could put it back in, but no need. Because all we're doing is we're going to use this as a context, to get context as an authorization attribute. So as you can see, by doing this, select MAC from auth where, yada yada, epoch, time, and that and auth status equals user, it shows that within this time frame that I'm checking, only one MAC address has authenticated successfully. Only one user with that MAC address. So now that I have this information, I can go over to ClearPass and I can create a source. And you guys can see I've already done this in here, so I understand I've created a source. In fact, you know what? I'll just create a new one so I can show you guys step by step. Okay, so my source 2, and this is going to be generic SQL. Primary, now the server name is just going to be, this could actually just be loopback 127.0.0.1. Port database name is Postgres, username, app external, and the password. Now this is very important to note. When you're building these SQL queries, there's some extra information down here that you need to provide. So first let's call it my filter 1. Let's paste my filter in here. But this filter is missing something. And what it's missing is it's missing a way for me to tie in my authentication and authorization into this actual query. So what I need to do is I actually have to say and MAC equals, this is going to be, this is percent, curly bracket, connection, and I think it's, I gotta remember. Now, basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at the MAC address from the incoming connection. So, because I can't remember what that's called. Show you guys I've built it down here already. Right, calling station ID. Now, the question is, where is this information coming from, right? So you see this percent, curly bracket, radius ETF calling station ID. That's actually coming in from the radius request. So anything that comes in on an incoming radius request, you can use in here and query the database, whatever your database is. So for example, if we go back out to Access Tracker and I grab one of my radius requests, I can see my input. I've got all of this information. You can see I've got the MAC address of the access point, the MAC address of the client, got IP address, I've got the SSID name because we're using Aruba, and Aruba passes that SSID name over. Now in authorization attributes, I can use any of that information I want. Computed attributes, so say you wanted a MAC address in a different format, if I wanted it in hyphen, or I wanted it in dot format, any of these variables can be used within your SQL query. And that's how you're nailing down that SQL query authorization source to say, does this specifically exist in the database? Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay. So now that I've built that authorization source, there's one more thing to tie it all together, and that is the alias name. So when you're building these SQL queries, you can see I'm doing select MAC in my SQL statement. So the select MAC, that MAC is the name of the attribute that I'm pulling out of the database. And that's what this name is right here. So this name field has to match something, some part of the select statement. So it has to be one of the fields, one of the columns in your database, in your table that you're looking at. Now the alias name is how I'm going to reference it in my enforcement profile. Excuse me, my enforcement policy. So you'll see in my enforcement policy rules, I'm going to reference this mac-check. I could call it whatever I want right there. As long as the name matches what I'm selecting up here, I could call this whatever I want. And I'm saying it's a string because the MAC address is string, and I'm enabling it as a role and attribute. So now that I've created this SQL query, and I've got my alias name mac-check, what I can do is go down into my enforcement policy. I'm just going to add a new enforcement policy, call it and I'll say default is deny access. And now in my rules, I can say authorization, my source. Since I only have one alias being returned from that source, that's the only option it gives me. And then all I have to say is exists. So that's it. That's all I have to do. Now when a .1x connection comes in, if this is part of the enforcement policy, if this is part of the enforcement policy, it's going to look at that authorization source, also assuming I've added that authorization source into the authorization tab. It's going to look at this, and if that MAC address exists, then it's going to hit this. It's going to hit this rule right here. So I'll show you where I've built this into I think I've added this into a .1x service. So again, I need to have that SQL query source added in as an authorization source, okay? Or else I will not get that information, that contextual information that I'm looking for. So now in my enforcement rules, you can see that I've got a rule here that says authorization, my source, MAC check exists, and tips role equals user authenticated. That tips role user authenticated basically just means that it was the authentication piece was successful. So regardless if I was using Active Directory or if I was using internal database or the guest database, any user that logs in successfully, that successfully passes authentication, gets the role of user authenticated. So that's why I put that in there. So it checks to see, okay, user is authenticated and authorization, my source, MAC check exists, then do something, right? Any questions? Any questions about or comments or thoughts about where this could be used, or questions about the versatility of this function? So the question is, so you have a customer that wants to notify someone ahead of time that their certificate's about to end, certificate's about to expire. And I'm assuming this is for ETLS, so certificate-based authentication. You wouldn't really need to do that. Let me think. I'm not sure. Well, let's take a step back and say, what system is holding these ETLS certificates? Is it Microsoft?
No, it's ClearPass.
Oh, it's ClearPass. Okay. So the question would come down to, if we get that information in the authorization attributes already, which we might. So that would be the first place I would look, is I would look at the authorization attributes. Now here, let me give you guys a quick tip about ClearPass that tends to be very helpful when you're first working with ClearPass and also building your services. Now, if I was just doing Active Directory, I'm already getting authorization for ClearPass AD. So I don't need it down here as well. In fact, I don't even need the authorization tab because it's going to get that information because it's the authentication source. But if you go in here and you enable authorization, which is done on the Services tab by checking this box to enable authorization. And then you add your Active Directory in a second time. What's going to happen now is in your radius requests, under your authorization attributes, you're going to see all authorization attributes that are returned by Active Directory, not just the ones that match the enforcement policies or the role mappings that you're using. So if you don't do this, you won't see all the member of attributes. You'll just see the one that you're looking for. So by doing this, by adding it in here, it helps you build that service and to understand, okay, is this user a member of which groups? And so it helps in the initial phases. And I would say take a look at that, see if it's coming in by adding the authorization source. I think it would be the onboard repository. I'd look there. If that isn't the case, then we would have to dig deeper into the databases, into the TIPS database, and see if there's any database available that has that expiration information. If it is, piece of cake, no problem. Because then we can say, okay, if, return true if this date is less than, 7 days away. Absolutely. So yeah, so what he said was that with that information, then we could, re-onboard the person or push them to a completely different captive portal that says, hey, your certificate's about to expire, you need to re-onboard again. All right, so the next thing, I think I covered everything about the external SQL queries. Again, guys, it's really versatile, and once you start looking into it, you'll discover a world of possibilities as to what you can get for authorization. Keep in mind, we work with Oracle 11G. It has to be Oracle version 11G. Can't be 10G. Postgres and MySQL. And I think is there anything else in there? Let's see. Of course, LDAP, Kerberos, Okta now, that's new as of 6.1. We can now connect to Okta and as an authentication source. And a static host list, which again, that's just internal MAC address lists usually, or list of IP addresses internally. So. All right, now I'm going to jump over to talking about Air Group and talking about one of the new features in ClearPass 6.1 version of Air Group. In ClearPass 6.1, we've added the notion of what's called a multi-selection tool. And what the multi-selection tool is it gives you a method for easier input and more sort of a usability, I would say. It makes the usability much, much easier. And now what that is, I'll show you guys what it looks like when it's working, which is this. So you can see in here, I'll just refresh this. I'm logged in as an Air Group administrator. So this would be an IT admin, but the same holds true for Air Group operator, or if you create a custom profile for an Air Group teacher or whatever. So you can see the shared with field has a little faded thing in here saying select one or more users. And so if I click in here and I start typing student, you can see it automatically fills in the name. I can put myself in here, I've got an account. And this is our multi-selection tool. Now, I don't have a controller to connect this ClearPass to, but if I did, you'd see that shared locations and shared roles are the same. They'll automatically fill, because what we're doing in 6.1 is we're actually SSHing into the controller to pull that information into ClearPass. So all your roles on your controller will show up in here. For shared locations, all your access points, all your AP groups, all your FQLNs, fully qualified location names, will show up under shared locations. And so you just click in the window and select the ones you want. Makes it really easy. You eliminate spelling errors, spelling mistakes. Think about it from the student perspective. They don't know how to spell their friend's name completely, but they want to share their Apple TV or their iTunes library with them. They can just start typing their name, and it automatically queries the LDAP. Now, this is how we configure that. So under operator logins in 6.1, now I'm covering the LDAP querying. The controller querying is just adding a controller in here, and you can see where we ask for the username, password, enable password, and then we pull the controller after that. And that's done on, you can do it manually after you add a device, or you can have, and you can have it scheduled. So you can see under configuration, it's scheduled to do it daily at 5:30 in the morning. But to configure the LDAP query, we have to go into operator logins and servers and actually have to add an Active Directory server. And you can see I've called it AD lookup. The name is important because you will need to reference this name in the field for the shared user, which I'll show you. So that's important. The other thing is important that I found is you must have this path. You must at least have CN equals users, DC equals, first part of your domain name, comma, DC equals second part of your domain name. And then you can see here I'm just using the bind DN as administrator at clearpasslab.com. Same for the bind username and the password. So after that part is entered correctly, I've checked a checkbox down here that says use this server to search for matching users. And then you've got some attributes down here. Now, my accounts that I created on my Active Directory, I cheated a little bit and created accounts that didn't actually have a display name. So I actually had to go in and change the text field to say Sam account name. Because otherwise, nothing showed up when I'd search for users. You just get blank lines because they didn't have display names. So keep that in mind if you're using different fields for names or different fields for accounts. This is where you would change and edit those things. So the ID is actually the user login account. And then the text is actually what shows up when we display these right here. So student 7, Z Jennings, faculty 6. So after I did that, checked that, saved it, the next step is to go and actually edit the field. If I go into, now I'm going to edit the air group shared user, because that's what we're looking for, right? We want LDAP lookup on the air group shared user field. So in here, we edit it. And this normally will just say text field. That'll be the default. So you need to change that to the multiple selection list. That's the first thing that needs to be changed. And then show advanced properties. And then down in here, you know what? I'm going to reset this just so you guys can actually see what it looks like normally. So I think that's important. So we go shared user role, and I'm going to reset to defaults. So now if I go into air group shared user, you can see it's a text field. I don't have any advanced properties. So now what I need to do is I need to change this to the multiple selection list. And then if I show advanced properties, you'll see this right here. So this is basically telling you that you need to put in there the name of your LDAP server, the name that we gave it over under administration LDAP servers. So mine, I just called AD lookup and save changes. Now there were some other fields down in there, or some other information. I think you can see multiple one, this is all stuff that you could edit, but I don't think you necessarily would need to. And that's what That's all you have to do to get this to look up LDAP usernames. And usually the one question that comes up is, are we going to have this available for operator, for sponsor approval? So a guest coming in, guest wants to create their account, and they have to type in the sponsor's name. What if they don't know how to spell the sponsor's name? Yes, it's not there today, but we are working on bringing that there as well. So that way we will automatically query LDAP. So that way your guest comes in, they don't have to know the person's name, they just have to know how to spell it a little bit, maybe the first name, and then they can select that person, and then the email will go to them. So that way they don't have to even know the person's email address. Any questions? When do I think that'll be available? I think it's a minor change. Cam, any ideas? 6.2? Okay. So Cameron's saying 6.2, which 6.2 is, I think, end of July timeframe. So we'll have that option to change the field, the guest login form, to choose multi-selection. Actually, it won't be multi-selection. It'll be a single selection because you wouldn't really want it to go to multiple people. But sure.
Actually, I'm configuring LDAP local is correct.
Yeah.
It's working fine.
Right, so you're making them type it in, and then it checks to make sure it exists, right? Right, so this is going to take that whole typing it in and remove it, because then they can just start typing the name, and then the name will pop up in a list, and they just click that name. So that way they don't even have to know the person's email address. So it'll just make it a little bit easier. So, sure. I know we do have some token server integration, but I don't know. So you need a mechanism to enter that. So that would be the issue, is you would need some sort of interface to be able to type that into. So.
But in the service you would have obviously what would be .1x doing ETLS, and then you need to have another server.
Yeah, there's probably a workaround we could do. We could probably do something about actually doing it as an authentication source and using that as a guest authentication source from a specific guest page that we could custom create and then query the token server that way. That would probably be the route to go. Is there anything else you guys want to see? It's like I can go through anything that you want to see right now. If you want to see how to create any kind of service, I can do it. You want to do like a Mac auth service? You want to talk about? Do you guys want to hear about Profiler and hear about profiling devices and the process of profiling devices and how you would check to see specific device types and whether or not they're allowed on an open SSID for those devices that don't do .1x? Want to see that? All right. Let's do it. So the idea behind this is that everybody has devices that don't do .1x. And the process by which we can get more contextual information is we actually intercept the DHCP packet. So what you do is well, not intercept, we actually receive the DHCP packet. So what you would do is on your router or on your wireless controller, you would add ClearPass as a DHCP relay. So you've got your regular DHCP relay, whether it be Windows or Infoblocks or whatever it is that you're using for DHCP, you would just add a secondary relay, which would be the ClearPass box. So after that was done, you'll see I've got a couple devices in here. Things will start showing up. So you can see I've got 2 Windows computers that showed up and a smart device, 2 smart devices, iPad and an iPhone. So the process by which we actually use Profiler is we actually, after we receive information about that device, we trigger a COA. We bounce the device. And that may seem a little odd, may seem a little foreign, but the idea is by once we get that contextual information, that DHCP packet, and are able to know something more about that device, we want it to come back through the authentication. Because then on the second time through authentication, we actually can use that information to say, oh, okay, I want you on this VLAN. Or, oh, okay, I want you to have this user role. So the way we would do that, let's add a service. We'll call it non-802 device. And we need to have this checkbox for profile endpoints. The reason why we have to have this checkbox for profile endpoints is that's how we're going to trigger the COA. Now, this doesn't mean, by checking that box, it doesn't mean that profiler's set up. Okay? You have to go and get the DHCP relay working before profiler will actually start receiving those DHCP packets. So you have to send them the DHCP information. So now that I've checked that box, I can go in my authentication. Now, on authentication, I don't want everybody to fail authentication. In fact, I want the exact opposite. I want everybody to be allowed on, because I want all devices to connect in, because I don't know what they are. I don't know if it's a printer. I don't know if it's a hacker. I don't know who it is. I want it to come on. Now, if it's a hacker, obviously, start thinking about that. You're going to want restrictions. You're going to want to put them into a role where they can't do anything. Well, that's fine. We can do that with a printer too. We don't know what it is. So we take that and we say, for the default device, we don't know what it is. Put it in a role or in a VLAN that all it can do is DHCP, and that's it. It can't ping, it can't SSH, it can't do anything else, it can't even get to a web page. Just DHCP, because that's all we care about. We just want that DHCP packet from the client. So my enforcement now, this is where we would do something different. Let's call this MAC non. Default profile, well, no one's going to hit the default profile because everybody succeeds, right? Because our authentication is allow all MAC addresses. So no one's going to hit the default profile, so we can do whatever we want for that. But now in the rules, you would take a top to bottom approach. You would say, actually, I take this back. I made one mistake. You would actually hit the default. You would want to use the default. And your default profile is the profile that you want to have only DHCP. That's what you want as your default. Only is basically the limited VLAN or limited access role that only allows that DHCP packet to come through. So for me, let's see. I don't have anything in here I can use. Well, I'll just leave it as deny access. Oh, no, let's go to, well, let's create a new one. Enforcement profile. Okay, so now I've got one DHCP only. So this is assuming that I had an Aruba controller, I was packing into an Aruba controller, and that Aruba controller had a role called DHCP only, and that role had ACLs, access control lists, that would block everything but DHCP. So now in my rules, what I would say is, I would say, not tips, I'm going to go endpoint. So I say endpoint category equals printer. And then for that, I'm going to allow access. So you could have multiples there. You would have one for every single category of devices that you would want to allow on. And so they would printer, access point, security camera, anything like that. You would have a specific role for each one of those as we categorize it. So now the next step is there's a very important box right up here. And this is the one thing that most people tend to miss. Actually, yeah. So use cache roles, posture attributes. I just want to talk about this for a second because if you're using contextual information from a previous session, now with Endpoint Profiler, we've got it stored in a database. We don't have to worry about this. But in a lot of cases, when we talk about on guard, so we're checking health, but in this case we're not. But if we were checking health, we'd have to check that box because we'd want to see it the next time through. But the same idea goes for on guard, goes for multiple authentications. You know, if we want to have different roles, if we want to see that it's user logged in as well as machine authenticated, you know, that's that checkbox right there. So we don't need it right now because we're actually just doing Profiler, and Profiler is actually just the database. But in the Profiler tab, we're going to select any category OS/family. Now what this information is, this means if anything changes, okay? So if any of those things change, category, OS, family, or name, we're going to do something. So this is where we trigger our COA. This is where a device goes from an unknown device to a known device type. So for that, we're going to do an Aruba terminate session. And that's pretty much it. That's all you have to do. Think about phones. You'd be passing back specific information for a phone that can't do .1x. There's only a handful of voice over IP phones that can actually do .1x. So you have to use this. You have to have a mechanism to detect that. And we don't want to have to enter in MAC addresses or use the MAC OUI. We want to be able to do things a little bit smarter. We want to look at the DHCP packet to know if it's a phone. Because what if you had, say you had Avaya voice over IP phones, and then someone decided that they wanted to buy the really nice Polycom, you know, conference rooms phones. If you built this correctly, you wouldn't have to change anything because it says, okay, I know it's a VoIP phone. I'm going to do the same thing, whether it's the Avaya phone or it's the Polycom phone. I'm still going to do the same thing. I'm going to treat it the same way. So that's sort of the idea behind Profiler and building these services out this way. The question is, do you need to be careful on how you order the services? It is top-down, but I'm not sure that a device can be a member of multiple. Oh, you mean the service in the list of services. Okay, okay. So the question is, do you have to be careful where the service goes in the list of services here? And the idea behind service numbering and the service levels is that, yes, you do need to be careful with those. It is a top-down approach. Think of it like a funnel, okay, or sifter. Think about it sifting rocks. You know, you want to sift the top first, and then you want your bottom to be your sort of catch-all. So in an environment, in a corporate environment, what I would do is I would create like an all else fails service to sort of, if you wanted to, just when you're starting off and you're building things, to see everything that's in there. Actually, that's in 602, actually maybe in 601, we changed it so that even if something comes in and it doesn't hit a service, it still shows up in Access Tracker. Before, you had to add a generic radius service at the bottom to catch everything. So that way you could see requests coming in that weren't hitting a service. But yes, you absolutely need to filter them, and the order definitely does matter. The more you can filter them, the better. So this, you can see, 802.1x wired is a very vague filter. I'm looking at Ethernet and login user. So I could trim this down by saying more things like, I could say it's coming from a specific switch. And that's anything that I want to put in here is based on the radius, incoming radius request. So again, if I go to monitoring, access tracker, we look at that, and we can see this is from an Aruba wireless incoming radius request. We can filter on any of this information. So if you wanted a filter that looked at part of a username and said, all right, I want to look at the domain name. So say you have a company and you've got 20 different domains. And you want to look at the username, so the user is something at CNN.com. But then you've got another user that could be coming in, and you want to do something completely different with them, even though they're coming in on the same wireless, you can actually put a filter at the beginning saying username contains CNN.com. Then hit this, it'll hit that service. If not, it'll go to the next one until it hits the service that it actually fits with. So the important ones usually are the ESSID name. With Cisco, we actually get an SSID number. They don't pass back the SSID name, and you have to enable the radius attributes for, I think it's aerospace, I believe. I'll show you guys that. It's under administration, dictionaries, radius, airspace. So that's this WLAN ID. So if you have Cisco Wireless and you want to have a different service hit based on the SSID where the user is connected, you need to enable this radius attributes dictionary. And then by enabling this, we'll actually see this information come in on the incoming radius request. Now, it's not as pretty as an Aruba SSID because we don't actually get the SSID name. We just get a number, and it's the number of the SSID on the Cisco controller. So it's a little bit more complicated to configure. And if you had multiple environments, the SSID numbering could be different based on the environment. So it depends on which SSID was created first. But it definitely gives you a lot more functionality and a lot more granular filtering ability. So as you can see in here, we have a lot of other dictionaries that can be enabled. There's actually 111 different dictionaries. And to start with, there's only a couple that are configured, Cisco being one. This Cisco, again, this is more for the wired side. The wireless, again, would be the airspace. And you can tell which ones are enabled because they're black and not red. So one of the things I would suggest is if you guys are using a different type of network access device other than Cisco wired, Aruba wireless, Aruba wired, go in here, enable the dictionary, and then see what comes in Access Tracker on the radius request. Because anything that comes in, we can use as a filter to hit a different service. Does that make sense?
Any other kind of authentication for those managed devices?
So you're talking about devices that do not do .1x. And the question is, what other information can we get about them? And the answer is we can also do Nessus scans. So we can do port scans on them. Yep. That's the other one. So DHCP, so when they hit ClearPass guest, sorry, that's not DHCP, that's HTTP. So HTTP, when they hit ClearPass guest, we get that information into the profiler. DHCP, when we receive the DHCP packet, we can get that information. And then we can also do Nessus scans to look for certain open ports. So for example, if you were using HP printers and HP JetDirect uses a specific port, you could configure the Nessus scanner to scan for that port. Onboarding? All right. let's talk about onboarding. So one of the nice things that we've done in 6.0, or excuse me, 6.1 for onboarding is we've added the idea of multiple provisioning settings. And sort of this gives you the ability to take onboarding into a multiple client scenario or a multiple SSID scenario. So if you wanted to have students onboarding, but they were connecting to one specific SSID, and teachers onboarding, but they're connecting to a completely different SSID, you can now do that with 6.1. If you were a service provider and you had small businesses and they wanted to do onboarding, but they all had their own custom SSID name, now we have the ability to create those different profiles. So that way, the web login will have their company name. That way, it'll connect to their SSID after the onboarding process. It's one of the nice new features in 6.1. It's been very requested many times. The other thing that's new in here is that now we have the idea of multiple certificate authorities. So again, you can have more than one certificate authority if you had multiple companies that you were serving onboarding to. Now, one of the common issues that I see with setting up onboarding, one of the things that I do is I also help out with partner training courses. And one of the most common issues when you're setting up onboarding is pre-auth check, pre-authentication check. And so pre-authentication check, what it does is it's looking to see if that username and password of that person who's trying to onboard is actually exists, if they're allowed to onboard. And so this is not something you want to disable. You want that enabled. But in the process, I always say go back to ClearPass Policy Manager and look in your access tracker. Because 9 times out of 10, when you run into issues with iOS devices and onboarding, for example, the most common one the profile will say, unable to install profile. And that's usually because of the pre-auth check is failing. It'll allow you to go further, and it'll allow you to get to the point where you get that profile from onboard. But you go back in, and the authentication will actually be hitting failures in Access Tracker. So keep that in mind if you start working with onboarding. We do have in 6.1 these service templates. And you see right here, here's the onboard authorization. And that's the authorization of saying, should I be allowed to actually connect to onboard? Let's see. Another big issue tends to be certificates with onboarding. And it's important to note that your client that's connecting needs to trust the entire chain. And that's one of the biggest issues that I see with .1x and with onboarding, is that the whole chain isn't there. And so we've got some documentation, I believe it's up on the support site, that walks you through getting the whole chain together. But it's important to note that you need that entire chain. Just because you bought a certificate from VeriSign doesn't mean that you can just import the certificate directly onto your system. There are going to be intermediaries that VeriSign uses to actually sign those certificates, and those have to be brought into the ClearPass system along with the root certificate and the one you purchased. So keep that in mind. So if we go under network settings, This, you can see the settings. This is just what wireless it's going to connect to, the name, SSID. The name is just what you want to call this service or this network settings. SSID name is down there. Let me see, there's one other. There's one thing I want to point out. I think it's provisioning settings. Okay. This is something that's new in 602. Created by device or created by server. Now what we did in 602 is some devices have the ability to actually create the certificate request. And so in this case, iOS devices can create the certificate request. Now, if you're grabbing authorization attributes from the certificate, it's best to have these created by server, because you won't be able to pull out that authorization attributes from the certificate information. I know earlier we were talking about expiration date, things like that. You won't be able to pull that out of the authorization attributes if it's created by device. So just something to keep in mind. Any other questions about onboarding? If you're just testing it and you're just starting out, I recommend disabling HTTPS for testing purposes. To disable HTTPS, you have to go into, let's see, configuration, authentication, and uncheck this box. When you start out, I highly recommend doing this, or else you can run into issues because you don't have a server certificate. So for testing purposes, go into there and uncheck it. Obviously, once you get a server certificate, you'll want to go back in there and check that box and switch back to HTTPS. But it is really useful for starting out to uncheck that. So keep that in mind. Well, we have some more time here, so what I'm going to do is I'm also going to talk about AirGroup a little bit more and some more detailed information about AirGroup. So in here you'll see that there's an RFC 3576 port. Now what this port is used for is it's actually used for an AirGroup COA update. This is a change of authorization, but it's not a change of authorization where we bounce the AirGroup device. So you're not going to see a new AirGroup authentication come into ClearPass. This is purely for sending out an update that's been made to a device. Now this is one of the most common mistakes or common issues that people run into. And this when it's not working, excuse me. And if it's not working, when you add a new user role or add a new location or add a new user to share it with, that won't get updated on the controller. And the biggest common issue I've seen with this is the fact that the controller, by default, in 6134-AirGroup and in 6136-AirGroup, blocks COA packets on port 5999. So what you have to do is you actually have to open up the firewall on your controller to allow these packets in. And if you look in the AirGroup configuration guide and you look in the AirGroup how-to tech note, they're both in there, the command that you need to run to open up that port. In 6.3, they've brought it in as a default. So it's open. So you don't have to worry about it in 6.3. But again, this is not a standard COA, and you cannot use the default port, the 3799 port. It has to be a different port. If you want to change this, you want to use a different port for security reasons, you can. You can use any standard unused port. But you need to keep in mind on the controller, you need to run that firewall command to open up that port to allow that information to come in. Questions?
There is a firewall between the ClearPass and the controller. Of course, we need to open.
The question is, if there's a firewall between ClearPass and the controller, what ports need to be open? And that actually is online. There is a document that lists out every single port. I believe it's at the beginning of the ClearPass user guide that explains every single port and what it's used for. The big ones, of course, are going to be COA, so regular COA, 3799, I believe that's UDP. Air Group COA, 3799 if you're using Air Group. You're going to need HTTP, HTTPS if you're using guest. And then there's another one, I believe it's, you'll need SSH if you're using Air Group, because again, Air Group SSHs into the controller, pulls that information. There's another port, I believe it's 6658. Again, it's in the document, and that port is used for constant communication between OnGuard. So if you're running OnGuard, our NAC product, if you're running OnGuard on your clients, you need port 6658 to be open to ClearPass because it's a constant communication from the client to ClearPass. If you don't have that open, the symptom is you will see OnGuard authentic health checks every 3 minutes. If you see that every 3 minutes, that means your port 6658 is being blocked. But again, in the release notes, or I think it's the user guide, all those ports that are used are listed. No, the question is that for the dissolvable client? No. The dissolvable client is purely HTTPS. No. Okay. Oh, one more. Go ahead. Yes?
Is there a limitation for the external sources that we add to?
The question is there a limitation to the external sources?
How many external sources we can add?
You're talking about SQL databases and whatever. Not that I know of. Cam, Carlos? No. 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 There's no limitation. No. Not today, no. Well, what you could do is you could go about adding checks for specific registry entries. That would be the method that I would go for. Yeah, if they're coming in with non-standard antivirus programs, then yeah. I mean, if you look at our list, we have, I forget how many are in the list, but there's hundreds in the list of antivirus software that we do support with OnGuard. So, any other questions? All right, thanks guys, appreciate it. And if you have any questions, you want to come up and see me, I'll be here for a couple more minutes or probably outside. Okay? Thanks.